Hey, I was listening to a video earlier today, and it was a low carb person, semi carnivore, whatever. But I'm not here to basically bag them because there's many people that just use the same old language and out there. And at some point, people need to understand how we actually oxidize food, where we have this deluded idea. Some people think that we're a bomb calorimeter. We burn it, and we produce calories and a bit of ash, apparently. Maybe they identify as a steam engine, maybe. But the reality is that we need to understand in plain English what actually is happening. Okay, so we eat food. It goes into our mouth. We start pre-digesting it. So we're just munching away to break down all that food mass that we've got in our mouth, and then that slowly goes down, down our throat through the esophagus. It hits there's right at the top where the stomach is. There's a valve, that sort of opens because it senses that there is stuff coming down. It takes it into the stomach. Once as you build up a certain volume, it starts then, depending on what the food that's gone in there, it can sense the difference. If there's more protein and fat, it's going to increase the acidity. So those proton pumps inside the stomach will actually release more of those hydrochloric acid. And so it depends. Your pH, if you're constantly eating more animal foods, it will then tend to be much lower, in the 1.5, potentially even down to 1, especially when you're younger and you can produce more stomach acid. In there, the stomach sort of has a sort of a bit of a contractile sort of function, which helps to further assist moving those juices around in order to break down and get that hydrochloric acid around into the little crevices between the food and slowly break it all down. And once that is happening, you've got your pancreas, which releases certain enzymes that help, let alone, we don't know, the hormones, insulin and glucagon. But let's just focus on the enzymes for now, that actually digestive enzymes, and they come out proteolytic, as they're called. They come out into the top part of the small intestine. That's where they come as the food comes out of the actual stomach from the bottom valve that opens and allows a certain proportion out, then closes because you digest over it. You break things down in your stomach over a couple of hours, and then you release small amounts to help with digestion. There's also the gallbladder. So the bile salts will come through from, that are manufactured in the liver, held in the gallbladder, released through the bile duct that comes right through the pancreas, and together with the pancreatic enzymes that come out, all those combined. One, obviously, the bile has the ability to increase the pH and lower the acidity levels. So it has a buffering effect, or some people call it an alkalinizing effect. Anyway, it increases the pH, and by doing that, you're able to reduce any potential risk to the small intestine, and also the emulsifying agents are able then to break down those fats, and some of those proteolytic enzymes will work on the fats sugars, and protein to break them down further, because you will get a high level of breakdown within the within the stomach into simple sugars, simple fats, fatty acids, and simple amino acids. But there also those enzymes can also facilitate further breaking down, and they will help to adjust things within the small intestine to allow then for the more smoother absorption. Without going into details, that's maybe for another video to look at stomach function and all these things. I've already done videos. If you go to my digestive stuff, I cover a lot of the internal processes within the digestive tract, which starts at the mouth and finishes at the anus, and it ends up in the bloodstream within the small intestine. So most of your proteins tend to be absorbed in that middle part of the small intestine, and most of the fats in the lower part of the small intestine, and sugars sort of in the first part and second part, more or less, give or take. I don't remember the exact measurements on their absorption rate. Yeah, it was a long time ago, so I can't remember. Now, that stuff goes into the actual system. Obviously, everything heads for the liver, is where everything gets processed, repackaged, and everything else. Obviously, the fats and the fat-soluble vitamins, they'll actually go through to the other end. So where you've got the wall between the inner part of the body and the outer part, which is your digestive tract, those fatty acids and all those will flow through, and they will head into a thing called, which is consider it a boat, a lipoprotein boat, which we call a chylomicron. Everything will get into that, and that will circulate around the body. For how long depends. There is genetics. The ApoE genetics determine how quickly that clears out of the system. People that have got an ApoE of 2.2 or tend to take the longest, and people like myself that have got 3.3 tend to be somewhere in between. Like the Dave Feldmans of the world and all that are ApoE4s, which tend to take up chylomicron remnants, whatever's left over, much faster into the liver. And that can create problems for those people because that's more the ancestral phenotype, which produced higher LDL-C as a consequence of that, but also is the way most tribal people were for the majority of their existence. As we got into agriculture, in order to reduce the influx of fat into the liver while it was processing sugars that we were consuming, and that's the reason for that. And if you populations that have been on agricultural diets for longer tend to have an ApoE of 2.2, and you usually find the 2.2s more prevalent in places like China, Japan, Korea, parts of Southeast Asia. It's the populations that have just consumed plants for far longer, and changing to that type of phenotype reduces the amount of sugars and fats inside the liver at the same time. And so it reduces the so-called construct of insulin resistance at the liver level. Now, getting back to simplicity again, all this stuff gets into the body, and eventually sugars and fats get into the cells of our body. So they circulate through, whether they are sugars circulating or whether they are lipoprotein carriers of fats. So chylomicrons, chylomicron remnants, VLDL, just coming out of the VLDL, IDL, LDL, and the different fractions of those lipoproteins. So they will go through the CD36 receptor, which is the pathway to beta oxidation, which is oxidizing fats, my lovely friends. And the other pathway, which is the GLUT receptors, will bring in the sugars, and that will go right through 10 enzymatic pathways. It will strip off all the deuterium, that naughty deuterium stuff, take all that out. And then eventually what we have is we have these carbons, which we can either use to manufacture other stuff that the body wants, or we can combine it with oxygen, and then we can breathe it out as CO2. The hydrogen ions that we take in through these enzymatic steps, and that process where we oxidize the carbons, they go out and float out of our body. That's mass out. And that mass in, part of that mass that comes in will flow further into the mitochondria, and then will go into the inner mitochondrial membrane. And then you've got all those folds. You've probably seen them in images and stuff like that. All those have got electron chains. So you've got the complex 1 to all the way through to 5, which is the ATPase, the little nanomotor. And so in each one of those folds, you'll have right down here, you'll have the ATPase. And so the pumps will push through those protons, so that they'll grab onto those ions of hydrogen, and they'll strip off that electron. There's enzymes in there that do it. Yes, talk about quantum. The body's got this quantum little device. These enzymes work at a quantum level. Rip off that electron to pretty much provide moving through the complexes to power those pumps, and pretty much the proton gets pushed in that inner mitochondrial membrane, and as the gradient builds, it pushes against the sides of those folds as they are. So it's in the inner mitochondrial membrane, the matrix is in the middle, and these are the folds are sort of like that. So you've got that sort of fold. Down here is where it's pushing, so the gradient builds up in here, and it will push through the ATPase, those little nanomotors that are rotating in high RPM, up to 9,000 RPM. And obviously, the younger you are, the better they rotate. The older you are, the slower or more damaged they are. Now, those protons will come through, and they'll be recombined because the oxygen will come through. You've got the electrons that come out of the system, and then you attach to those protons and you create metabolic water. Voila! I've got internal water, hydration. And as those protons come through and those nanomotors turn, they grab an adenosine diphosphate and stick. It's like putting it on the conveyor belt and just sticking a phosphate, and that becomes adenosine triphosphate, the energy currency of the cell. And you have some photonic energy that gets released as part of the process, and some Gibbs free energy. Wow, God, that stuff. And, if you had a device there, you'd probably be able to measure some of that. And that ATP will go inside the cell. There's a whole lot of machinery in there that need that energy, and they'll take it and they'll use it. There's organelles there that require it to be able to go and do some work and repair and stuff like that. And that's really what's happening to your food. There's no calories involved. There's no burning involved. There's no ash involved. It's pretty much all these enzymes that are pulling apart these basic molecules. So you've got that fatty acid or that sugar, and it's just ripping off those protons and then dealing further down at the oxidation, as it's called, dealing with the carbon. And further inside, you're using the other part, which is the hydrogens, to go through that other machinery to produce the ATP, which is the currency energy of our body. It's a fantastic system. What engineering, the quality of engineering, the functioning, such intricate machinery that exists in there, biological machinery that exists in there to produce your weight in ATP. So if you're, let's say, as an example, an average person, 70 odd kilos, or an average male, you can produce, if you're healthy, you can produce 70 kilos of ATP in one single day. Pretty awesome. So that can be from food or from stored resources. And what are those stored resources, you will say? Well, glycogen stores, your sugar that's stored away in your liver and parts of your muscles. So your glycogen stores, or fats inside, obviously those triglycerides, when they're broken down, you'll get the fatty acids that are going to go through the CD36 receptor site, and the glycerol backbone that can be used to produce new glucose based on the demand that the body has in that regard. And the body can, anything that doesn't have like excess of this or excess of that it doesn't need, it just pees it out or pushes it out through the feces. So a lot of, our minerals and stuff like that, 90% of manganese or 90% of many other minerals will get pushed out of either the feces or be urinated out through the kidneys. So one of the two, it depends. Like copper, things like copper and things like manganese and things like vitamins like retinol, they'll go through a lot of the fat soluble vitamins, they'll go through the bile, and so they'll be out through the feces. Many of the other minerals, like your potassium, magnesium, and all that, usually calcium, because there has to be a certain amount inside the cells and outside the cells of these key electrolytes. There's usually a lot of the homeostatic regulation of that. How much is thrown out and how much is kept is determined by your kidneys. So that's why you need to keep healthy kidneys. Remember, kiddies, eat your protein, eat your protein. They keep your kidneys healthy and bigger. Remember the rat thing? They gave it casein 70%. What happened? Big rat and big, ginormous kidneys. Yes, that's how I reversed my dad's kidney atrophy and his low blood and his high blood pressure. And now he's 90 and has, well, his last test, 117/77. How do you get that? Well, simple, kiddies. You eat a lot of protein and you don't need sugar because that just causes water retention, and that's pressure on your kidneys. Yes. Insulin, that nasty thing that only sugar will raise. Yes. Raised from the dead, sugar. God, incredible. So that's in the most simplistic terms that I can give you, plain friggin' English. That's how it really works. It's that elegant and simple. And now you understand it. You can explain it just as easily. We don't need to complicate things. I did throw a few scientific terminologies in there. Bad, Harry. Yes. I should have kept it to plain English. Yes, that's what we do on this channel. We keep it at plain English because the majority of you guys are not physiologists or biochemists, And if you wanted to be, you'd go and actually do it as a degree. Well, nowadays, yes, the quality isn't what it used to be. Look at that bald man Bart. He's still got a few videos there that actually explains some of these in more detail, more scientific terminology for you geeks out there that want that version, not the plain English version. But most of my subscribers are not biochemists or physiologists, or, they're not into that. They don't understand those terminologies. They just want to know how it works. And that's basically how our body takes, fats and sugars and proteins, or the fat that we have in our body, or the sugar that we have stored in our liver and muscles, and we utilize it through these mechanisms, these beautiful, elegant mechanisms. And it gives us the energy to keep as long as we're alive, that is. Yes, it all stops once you've carked it. But until that point, your body is very smart and knows what it's doing. And it adjusts all the, a whole lot of enzymes and a whole lot of hormones and many other processes within the body, produces all these little, peptides they're called, which is just a chain of amino acids that have certain functions. They can actually act as transporters for minerals and many other things. And so you've got all this machinery, all these things, moving things around our body so our body can utilize them for a number of biological functions. But basically, that is what really is happening in the body as far as what it does to food in order to produce ATP, which is the currency energy of our body. Because that's what our body uses, ATP, to power a whole lot of things inside our body. Even at the filaments, you're using, yes, glucose, but there is, an ADP, ATP part of that for that utilization at the filaments. So it's not as if it's just happening magically like that. So at every single part, there's these mechanisms inside our body that furnish energy. Now, as far as the difference with the filaments is that they use glucose, where inside the mitochondria they use either fat or sugar. But you don't need to eat, obviously, you don't need to eat the sugar because your body, through gluconeogenesis, can produce as much as you need. So, and have enough stored in its liver, enough stored in its muscles, because all you really need it is for those contractile functions. The actual muscle cells themselves, much better to be on fat and only fat. And that glycerol backbone that comes off the fatty acid and some of the aminos are more than enough to produce that small amount of sugar that's required to function. And people like Steve Phinney and Jeff Volker, who are, you probably haven't heard of them. If you're around 15 years ago, you would have, because they were very big in the low carb community. These two scientists, one, Jeff's still around, Steve Phinney, he's retired now, and they did, real, lock-in studies with athletes. They had them on push bikes, and they were taking biopsies every hour. So they were actually seeing in real time that pretty much there was no difference between an athlete consuming sugar and an athlete consuming fat and was fat adapted. There was no difference. The body could furnish as much as it required, for those filament contractile sort of effects. And all the other cells just ran on the fatty acids, on fats, and because it's, producing ATP through the process that I just mentioned earlier, and in the brain, ketones and some sugars. You don't need a lot, which means it also reduces the glycating effect. And then the taurine that we produce endogenously, also we get from the meat, is more than enough to do a nice thing of reducing glycation inside, not only in the body, but also has an anti-glycating effect in the brain, which is very important, and also can reduce the glycation on the amyloid plaque, which allows it to basically refold properly. And then by refolding properly, it can clear. If it's too glycated, it can't fold. And that's where taurine comes in and does two things: gets rid of the glycation factors, reduces them, and also allows, because it prevents the misfolding of proteins, which is a big thing in longevity. And that's why taurine is touted as a longevity thing. And I use it as a biohack for that as well. But the reason is because it can actually force the refolding and also can reduce the glycating factors of circulating sugar. Now, on a low carb, carnivore, or ketogenic of whatever sort diet, you're going to have far lower levels of circulating blood sugar. So that's going to be less of an issue. And which is good, because that means more of that taurine that's being synthesized, and we get more as carnivores because we consume more of the amino acids required, like methionine and cysteine, required for the synthesis of taurine itself. We end up with far more in our tissue, which is a good thing, which keeps the oxidative stress down, helps the mitochondria, helps the cell, and it regulates a whole lot of functions, and it calms us down as well, and helps increase melatonin, which is, and not only, the pituitary side of things, but also inside the mitochondria, which is really, really good. So it facilitates that process. So in terms of what we need for our cells, mitochondria to be powered, best stuff, cleanest fuel, lowest deuterium fuel, because remember deuterium, the neutrons, too many neutrons slow down the ATPase or can damage them, and that means your mitochondrial efficiency drops with age because of this damage. Especially we notice that the health span of modern people does this, where tribal people usually are very little decline in later years and then they just drop dead because no more cell division. So it's the better way of going about things. But anyway, that was the process of how we utilize sugars and fats in the body. No, we're not a bomb calorimeter. No, we're not a steam engine. If you want to identify as one, who am I to prevent you from doing that? Just make sure you get one of those sort of bells, train bells. They sort of throws out a bit of smoke. Do it properly. If you're going to identify something, do it properly. But the rest of us that haven't lost our minds yet, we understand now how it actually works, and ain't the way it's been told. Yes. So unless you're burning your food, you ain't going to be dealing with calories. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Take care. Have a good day. See yous.